Get away from him, Emily screamed, throwing herself between the three men and the bleeding biker on the ground. She was 19 years old, homeless, and invisible to this town. She had nothing. No name anyone knew, no address, no phone, just the clothes on her back and whatever was left of her courage. You want him, you're going through me first. One of the men laughed. That laugh would cost all three of them everything. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Emily Parker stepped out from behind the dumpster, she had no plan. That was the truth nobody tells you about real courage. It doesn't come with a strategy. It doesn't come with backup. It arrives the way lightning does, sudden, unreasonable, and impossible to take back once it strikes. She had been living behind Denny's for 11 days. Not the Denny's on the nice side of Prescott Valley, but the one on the edge of town where the parking lot lights had burned out 2 seasons ago, and nobody had bothered to replace them. The kind of place where a 19-year-old girl with a sleeping bag and a cracked water bottle could disappear completely, and nobody on either side of the glass would register her absence from the world. She'd gotten good at disappearing. 3 months on the streets of Arizona had taught her that. You keep your eyes down. You don't make contact. You don't speak unless spoken to. And even then, you answer in as few words as possible and move on before the person decides you're their problem to solve or their target to aim at. Invisibility was a skill she developed the way other girls her age were developing careers, relationships, credit scores. Emily Parker had developed the art of not being seen, which was why what she did that night made so little logical sense. She'd heard the motorcycles first, that deep rolling thunder that Prescott Valley residents either loved or resented depending on which side of the valley they lived on. She'd peeked around the corner of the dumpster just to look, just curiosity, and watched the big man park his bike near the back of the lot. He was older, maybe 60, built like someone who had spent decades doing physical work that left its mark on a person. Gray beard, black leather vest covered in patches that Emily couldn't read from where she stood. He moved with the kind of deliberate ease that comes from a man who's never had to rush for anyone. She'd watched him walk toward the diner's back entrance, probably a shortcut, probably a man who knew the area well enough to use the roads others didn't bother with. She'd pulled back behind the dumpster, made herself small, again default setting. Then she heard the voices. 3 of them, young. That particular pitch of male entitlement that Emily had learned to identify the way you learn to identify the sound of a car engine that's about to give out something wrong underneath the confidence, something hollow and mean. Hey, old man, nice bike. She didn't look. She told herself not to look. Whatever was happening out there was not her business, was not her fight, was not something a homeless girl with no phone and no allies needed to insert herself into. She pressed her back against the cold metal of the dumpster and stared at the wall 6 inches from her face. I said, nice bike. You deaf or just stupid? She heard the big man's voice then, low, even. The voice of someone who didn't scare easily. Walk away, boys. End the night right. Boys, a laugh, young, ugly with something rehearsed in it like cruelty that had been practiced until it felt natural. You hear that he called us boys? We're not boys, old man. You have no idea who you're talking to. Tyler Bradford, one of the others said, and even from behind the dumpster, Emily could hear the pride in it, the kind of name dropping that meant the name was supposed to mean something, was supposed to carry weight, was supposed to make people stand down. His dad owns half this county. That's so, the older man said, still even, still calm. Well, his daddy can't help him tonight if he doesn't walk away right now. That was when Emily heard the first hit. It wasn't a punch. It was something harder, a crack she felt in her back teeth, the sound of something solid connecting with something that couldn't absorb it. And then she heard the grunt of a man hit from behind and the heavy shuffle of boots on asphalt, and 3 voices that had stopped performing and started doing something uglier and more efficient. She told herself to stay still. She told herself 3 times. The 4th time she told herself she was already moving. She came around the corner at a full run, which she hadn't planned and couldn't entirely explain later. What she saw, 3 men, early 20s, expensive clothes, Tyler Bradford and his 2 friends working over a man who had already gone down on one knee. The big man, Iron Jack, she would learn his name later, was absorbing hits with the grim endurance of someone who had been in bad spots before, but there were 3 of them, and the angle was wrong, and his left arm was hanging in a way that suggested something had already been broken or badly damaged. One of the friends had something in his hand, not a weapon exactly, but heavy a flashlight, a tool from the car. Emily didn't stop to analyze. "Get away from him," she screamed. All three men turned. She'd thrown herself between them and Jack, without quite meaning to, the way you throw your hand out to catch a glass that's falling off a table, pure reflex before reason can intervene. She stood between them and the downed man with her arms out, and she had nothing. No phone, no weapon, no name they would recognize. Just 5'4" and 120 pounds of sheer irrational human will. Tyler Bradford looked at her the way you look at something that's appeared from nowhere and made itself inconvenient. Not frightened, not even particularly surprised, just recalibrating. "Who the hell are you?" "It doesn't matter who I am," Emily said, and her voice was shaking, but she didn't step back. "Leave him alone." "She's nobody," one of the friends said, the one holding the heavy flashlight. "She's the dumpster girl. I've seen her back here." Something moved across Tyler Bradford's face. Not quite a smile. Something worse than a smile. A nobody defending a nobody. He tilted his head. "That's actually kind of sweet." "Walk away," Emily said. "Someone's going to call the police." "You think anyone in this parking lot is calling the police?" Tyler looked around at the empty night, the burned-out lights, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. "You think anyone even knows we're back here?" Behind her, she heard Iron Jack's shift. His voice came out rough, strained, but controlled. "Girl, you should go." "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said. "That's unfortunate," Tyler Bradford said and stepped forward. What happened next was fast in the way that violence is always fast, not like the movies, not choreographed and clear, but sudden and crowded and confusing. Emily threw herself sideways to block the first swing, felt it catch her across the shoulder instead of connecting where it was aimed, felt the shock of it travel up through her collarbone in a way that told her that she'd be feeling that for days. She grabbed the arm. Held on. It was a stupid thing to do from a tactical standpoint, but it bought Iron Jack 2 seconds of breathing room, and he used them. The big man got one knee under himself, swung, connected with the friend on the left hard enough that the friend went into the car he'd been standing beside and didn't immediately come back. 2 against 2 for about 4 seconds. Then Tyler Bradford's second friend grabbed Emily from behind, and the calculation changed again. "Let me go." She drove her elbow back, made contact, heard a curse. His grip loosened just enough. She twisted, pulled, nearly got free. Then she was hit from the side and she went down on the asphalt, and her hands took the impact, and the skin of both palms opened up, and the pain of it was a bright, clear thing that cut through everything else. From the ground, she could see Iron Jack. He'd gotten fully upright, which shouldn't have been possible for a man who'd been hit that many times, but he was standing, and his fists were up, and his eyes were doing a specific thing, a calculation, not anger, a cold professional reading of the situation. 3 men, one of them was already hurt. The girl on the ground, his damaged left arm, the odds and the geometry. "Stay down," Tyler Bradford told her. He wasn't even looking at her now, which in a terrible way was worse than being the target. She was already beneath his attention, already solved. Emily Parker had spent 3 months learning how to be invisible, how to be beneath attention, how to occupy the spaces that other people walk past without registering. She got up. Not fast, not graceful. She got up the way you do when your hands are bleeding and your shoulder is screaming and your body is sending urgent messages from every direction that it would very much prefer to remain on the asphalt. She got up anyway, slow and deliberate, and she stood behind Iron Jack again, and she made herself as wide as she could, which wasn't wide, but it was what she had. "You don't quit," Tyler Bradford said. And for the first time since this started, Emily heard something in his voice that wasn't quite contempt, something closer to discomfort. The discomfort of a man who is very accustomed to things going exactly the way he expects them to go. "No," Emily said, "I don't." Behind her, Iron Jack said nothing, but she heard his breathing change, a slight steadying, like a man who has just recalculated and found something in the recalculation that he didn't have a word for yet. The next 3 minutes were the kind that last much longer in memory than in time. Tyler Bradford and his friends, 2 of them now, the third still sitting against the car, holding his jaw, pushed hard. Iron Jack took 2 more hits, but he gave them back with the focused economy of a man who knew how to fight for real. Emily caught a glancing blow to her ribs that dropped her breath completely and left her gasping in a way that was frightening because she couldn't figure out for a long moment whether the breath was going to come back. It came back. She kept standing. She kept getting back between them every time there was an opening to do it. It was Tyler Bradford's second friend who finally hesitated. He'd swung at Emily twice and she'd absorbed it twice and she hadn't run, and something about that fact was getting into his head in a way he wasn't prepared for. He took a step back, then another. "Tyler," he said. "Tyler, man, this is—" "Shut up," Tyler Bradford said. "There's cameras on that building. I can see the light." There was a pause, a specific kind of pause, the kind that happens when the calculation that's been driving a situation suddenly changes, and everyone in it has to adjust to the new numbers. Tyler Bradford looked at the building, looked at Emily, looked at Iron Jack, who was still standing, still watching him with those cold professional eyes. "This isn't over," Tyler said. "Not a threat exactly, more like a man recording a fact." "You're right," Iron Jack said. His voice was different now, lower, quieter, with an undertone Emily couldn't read yet but would recognize later. "It isn't." Tyler Bradford and his remaining standing friend walked back toward the far side of the parking lot. Unhurried. Performing unhurried, which was different. The third one pulled himself up from beside the car and followed, and the sound of their footsteps faded, and then there was just the distant traffic noise and the yellow light above the diner's back door, and the two of them standing in the wreckage of the last several minutes. Emily became aware of how much everything hurt. She became aware of her hands, which were still bleeding, of her ribs, which had a specific hot, tight quality that she associated from previous experience with at least a significant bruise and possibly something worse, of her shoulder, which had dropped to a dull throb that she was fairly sure would become considerably less dull once the adrenaline finished leaving her system. She turned to look at Iron Jack. He was looking at her. He had blood above his left eye and his arm was hanging wrong, and his vest was torn at the shoulder, and he was looking at her with an expression that she couldn't entirely categorize. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly. Something more complex than either of those things, the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he did not anticipate and is in the process of deciding what it means. "You live back there?" he asked, nodding toward the dumpster. Emily considered lying, old habit. "Yes." "How long?" 11 days here. 3 months total." He nodded slowly, like he was filing information. "You got a name?" "Emily." "Jack." He paused. "People call me Iron Jack." "I figured it was something like that." She wasn't sure why she said it. The adrenaline was still doing things to her filters. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. Then he looked down at her hands. "You need those looked at." "I'm fine." "You're bleeding." "I've bled before." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I can see that." He reached into his vest and pulled out a phone. His left hand wasn't working right, the arm still hanging, so he held the phone in his right hand and she watched him dial without looking at the screen, like a number called, often enough to live in muscle memory. 2 rings, then a voice on the other end. "Prospect," Iron Jack said. His voice had gone to something she hadn't heard from him yet, flat and specific, the voice of a man transmitting information on a channel where economy matters. "Get on the line, call the brothers, tell them what I tell you, and tell them exactly this way. Iron Jack is down in Prescott Valley. Denny's on Route 69, and I need eyes and witnesses here in 30 minutes. Then you call Marcus. Then you call the Flagstaff chapter president directly." "You got that?" She couldn't hear the response, but she heard the change in the voice on the other end. Alert, immediate, yes. Jack lowered the phone. He stood very still for a moment. "What happens now?" Emily asked. He looked at her again with that same unclassifiable expression. "Now," he said, "things get complicated." Emily didn't know what that meant yet. She sat down on the curb next to him because her legs had decided to stop cooperating and her body had started having the conversation with her that bodies have when the emergency is over and the bill comes due. Her ribs hurt in a way that was no longer dull. Her hands were worse. Her shoulder had arrived at the destination she'd expected it to arrive at. But she'd gotten up off that asphalt. She'd gotten up twice. She'd stood between a man who had nothing to do with her and 3 men who could hurt her without any consequence. She could identify. And she'd stood there because something in her, something the streets hadn't taken yet, something 3 months of invisibility hadn't scraped away, had simply refused to let the other option be the one she chose. She didn't know Iron Jack, didn't know what the call he'd just made would set in motion, didn't know that Tyler Bradford's father was indeed one of the most influential men in Yavapai County, or that Tyler Bradford had walked through life with that influence as armor that had never once been penetrated. Didn't know what was coming toward Prescott Valley in the hours ahead, like weather building over the Bradshaw Mountains, slow at first, then all at once. She just sat on the curb with her bleeding hands and her complaining ribs, and she waited the way she had learned to wait, which was quietly and without expectation. But something was different now. For 11 days behind that dumpster, Emily Parker had been practicing the discipline of not mattering, of taking up no space, of needing nothing and being noticed by no one and leaving no mark on the surface of the town that had never learned her name. She'd done a very good job of it. And now a man named Iron Jack was sitting beside her on the curb with his phone in his hand and his broken arm and his eyes that had looked at her with something she didn't have a word for yet. And somewhere in Prescott Valley and beyond it, in Flagstaff and Phoenix, and on the roads between, phones were ringing and engines were starting and men were pulling on leather vests in the dark. Emily didn't know any of that yet. She just sat, and for the first time in 3 months, she was not invisible. She was in fact precisely the opposite. And the night, which had started like every other night, cold and indifferent, and certain of her smallness, was only just beginning. The first police cruiser arrived 17 minutes after Iron Jack made his call. Not because anyone at the diner had dialed 911, not because a passing driver had seen something and stopped. It arrived because Iron Jack had made a second call, quieter, shorter, the kind where you say 4 words and the person on the other end already knows the rest. And because in Prescott Valley, like in most small Arizona towns, certain names move certain machinery faster than others. Jack hadn't used Tyler Bradford's name on that second call. He hadn't needed to. Officer Dean Hartley pulled into the back lot and stepped out of his cruiser and took in the scene with the practiced neutrality of a man who has spent 15 years arriving after the fact and being asked to reconstruct what happened from the evidence left behind. He saw Iron Jack sitting on the curb. He saw Emily beside him. He saw the blood on her hands and the angle of Jack's arm, and the tire iron lying on the asphalt 12 feet away, which nobody had touched because Iron Jack had told Emily very specifically not to touch anything, using a tone that made suggestions feel like physics. Hartley looked at the tire iron, looked at Jack, looked at Emily. "Who else was here?" he asked. "3 young men," Iron Jack said. "Tyler Bradford. 2 others I didn't get names for. They were here when I arrived, and they left about 20 minutes ago in a white Range Rover, current year model, partial plate, Hotel Romeo 4. Hartley wrote that down. His face did not change. "You get that plate off the vehicle." "I got it while they were hitting me," Jack said. "Habit." Hartley looked at Emily. "And you were present." "She was present," Iron Jack said before Emily could answer. "She intervened. She's the reason I've got 2 eyes still working instead of 1. Emily said nothing. She was watching Hartley the way she had learned to watch authority, carefully reading the small signals that most people didn't bother to look for. The way his pen slowed when Jack said Tyler Bradford's name. The way he glanced toward the main road and back. Small things. Telling things. "Miss," Hartley said, addressing her directly now, "can you confirm what he said? You witnessed the assault." "I didn't just witness it," Emily said. "I was in it." "She needs medical attention," Iron Jack said. "Her ribs, her hands, before anything else that." "I'm fine," Emily said again for what felt like the 4th time, which was becoming less convincing each time she said it. "You are not fine," Iron Jack said, without heat, without argument. "Just a fact delivered flatly. Your left side is guarding. You've been sitting at the same angle since we sat down because straightening hurts too much. And your hands need cleaning or they'll be infected by morning." Emily looked at him. He was right about all of it. She just hadn't expected him to notice. Hartley called for a second unit and an ambulance. While they waited, he took a preliminary statement from Iron Jack, precise, chronological, detailed, in the way that told Emily this was not the first time the man had given a police statement after a violent incident. He remembered the sequence. He remembered the words used. He noted the tire iron and identified which of Tyler Bradford's friends had been holding it and at what point in the confrontation it had made contact with Jack's arm. That's aggravated assault with a weapon, Emily said before she thought about whether to say it. Both men looked at her. I know because it happened to someone I knew, she said, not explaining further. Old habit reasserting itself. Hartley's expression shifted slightly, not toward dismissiveness, which she'd expected, but towards something she was less prepared for. Something attentive. You'll need to give a statement too, he said. I know. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. The paramedic who came to Emily first was a woman in her 40s named Renee, who did not treat Emily the way most people in uniform had treated her in the past 3 months, which was to say she did not look through her, did not speak slowly, did not adopt a particular practice patience that some people use with the homeless that is indistinguishable from the patience used with the very young or the not quite competent. She looked at Emily's hands and said, okay, that's manageable, and at Emily's ribs and said, we're going to need an x-ray for that, and moved with the clean efficiency of someone who has too much work and no energy for condescension. I don't have insurance, Emily said. I know. Renee said the same way Iron Jack had said you are not fine, like it was a fact, not a judgment. We're still taking you in. They were loading Iron Jack into the second ambulance. His arm was fractured in 2 places, which he had apparently been aware of, and had chosen not to mention to Emily, reasoning she had enough to deal with when the first motorcycle arrived. Emily heard it before she saw it. That distinct sound, but solo this time. A single bike pulling into the lot, then 2 more behind it, then distantly more. The paramedic Renee paused in what she was doing. Officer Hartley turned toward the road. The second unit officer who'd arrived put his hand briefly to his radio without quite keying it, the gesture of a man checking whether the tool is there without deciding yet whether to use it. From the ambulance, Iron Jack's voice, that's my people. The first rider into the lot was a man about Jack's age, shorter, heavier, with a beard that was still more brown than gray, and the bearing of someone who ran things and was accustomed to other people knowing it without being told. He stepped off his bike and walked directly to where Emily was sitting on the ambulance step, and looked at her hands and her side and her face, and then looked at Officer Hartley and said in a voice like gravel and authority, who did this? We're conducting an investigation, Hartley said. I didn't ask how you're describing it. I asked who did it. He looked at Emily. You the girl Jack called about? He called about me. He called about a girl who stepped into a 3-on-1 to pull his ass off the pavement. He extended his hand. It was a formal gesture, deliberate, like shaking hands meant something specific. Marcus Webb, chapter president Flagstaff. Emily shook his hand because there was nothing else logical to do. Emily Parker. Emily Parker, he repeated like he was recording it. You live back there. Not a question he'd already been told clearly. Not by choice, Emily said. Something moved through Marcus Webb's face that wasn't pity. She'd gotten good at identifying pity. You see a lot of it on the streets, and it's rarely useful. This was different. This was something closer to anger, but directed inward at a situation rather than at a person. The look of a man recalibrating what the world had allowed to happen and finding the accounting unacceptable. Okay, he said. He said it the way people say okay when they mean the opposite of okay when they mean something that will be addressed. Then he turned and walked toward Iron Jack's ambulance, and the 2 men spoke in low, rapid voices for 90 seconds, and Emily watched Hartley, watching them, and watched the 2 other officers watching the bikes that were still arriving 2 and 3 at a time, now filling the far end of the lot. The paramedic Renee touched Emily's arm. We need to move. I need to, Emily started. You need an x-ray and to have your hands sutured, Renee said. Everything else will still be here. Emily looked at Iron Jack, who had turned from Marcus and was looking at her through the open ambulance doors. He gave her a single nod, the kind of nod that carried information. She wasn't sure what information yet, but it didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like continue, like I've got the rest of this, like go. She went. She didn't sleep in the ambulance. She lay on the narrow padded surface and stared at the ceiling and listened to Renee's efficient notation into the radio and thought about Tyler Bradford's face when she'd gotten up off the asphalt the second time, the specific quality of his discomfort, the way he'd looked at her not with the rage she'd expected, but with something that might in another context have been called unease. The unease of someone whose certainty about how things worked had been briefly and irritatingly interrupted. She thought about his name, Tyler Bradford, said with pride by his friend like currency. His dad owns half this county. She had grown up in Tempe, 45 minutes south of here, and even before everything fell apart, she had known that names like that existed. Names that meant something. Names that opened doors and closed investigations and made problems go away with a phone call. She had never expected to be the kind of problem that a name like that needed to solve. The X-ray confirmed 2 cracked ribs. The attending physician, a thin man named Dr. Okafor, who spoke quickly and moved faster, wrapped her prescribed something for the pain and told her not to exert herself for 4 to 6 weeks, with the tone of a man who understood he was giving advice that circumstances might make very difficult to follow. The sutures on her hands were 14 total, 6 on the left, 8 on the right. Renee did them herself. Emily didn't make a sound during any of it. "You've had stitches before," Renee said. Not quite a question. "Once," Emily said. "Different situation." Renee nodded. She had the gift of not pressing, which Emily had found was rarer than it should have been. The hospital waiting room was where it started to become real. Emily had been moved to a chair near the ER admissions desk while paperwork was sorted out. There was a substantial amount of paperwork involved in being a homeless 19-year-old with no insurance receiving emergency medical care, and the woman behind the desk was working through it with a determined focus that Emily appreciated because it meant she wasn't being treated as an afterthought. She was being treated as a problem to be solved, which was at least a form of dignity. She was sitting there, her wrapped hands in her lap, the medication starting to take the sharpest edge off the rib pain when the door opened. Marcus Webb walked in first, then 2 others, younger men in the same vest, same patches. Then behind them, Iron Jack, who should not have been walking under his own power with a double fracture, but was doing it anyway, his left arm now in a temporary splint, moving with the same deliberate economy as always, just slower. "You were supposed to stay," Emily said. "They couldn't make me," Iron Jack said simply. He sat down beside her, which took visible effort that he did not acknowledge. "Your arm is fractured, not gone. I've ridden with worse." He looked at her wrapped hands. "How bad are the ribs?" "2 cracks, not breaks. I'll be fine in a month." "You'll be in pain for a month," he corrected, without any apparent attempt to make this sound better than it was. She was starting to understand that this was how he operated, not unkind but precise. He said what was true and did not decorate it. "Iron Jack," she said and stopped. "Jack is fine." "Jack?" She looked at her hands. "You didn't have to come in here." "No," he agreed, "I didn't." Outside through the wide glass doors of the ER entrance, she could see the parking lot. It had, in the 25 minutes since they'd arrived at the hospital, undergone a transformation. There were motorcycles out there now, not 2 or 3, not the handful that had arrived in the Denny's lot. She counted without meaning to count and stopped at 30 and kept going and arrived at a number that she didn't quite believe, so she counted again. 45 bikes, more arriving as she watched, men and women in leather standing in clusters, not agitated, not loud, organized. The same quality Iron Jack had, deliberate. "Are those all?" she started. "Some from Flagstaff," Marcus said from the chair 2 seats down where he'd settled with his phone. "Some from Phoenix. Williams' chapter is on the way. There are brothers coming from Tucson." He glanced up from his phone. "Word travels." "Because of tonight." "Because of tonight," he confirmed. "Because Jack called it in as a full situation, not just a personal matter." He looked at her steadily. "Because of what you did." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She was 19 years old and she'd lived behind a dumpster for 11 days, and she had cracked ribs and 14 stitches. And somewhere in this town, Tyler Bradford was either at home in a comfortable house or out with his friends, convincing himself that the evening had gone fine, and the tire iron had been a reasonable choice, and the homeless girl had been nobody and was still nobody, and nothing that happened in that parking lot was going to follow him home. She held that thought, held it very carefully, because she had been on the streets long enough to know exactly how that calculation usually resolved. Names like Bradford, lawyers that answered on the first ring, fathers who knew the right people, investigations that went nowhere slowly and then went nowhere fast and then stopped being investigations. "Jack," she said, "be honest with me. What actually happens to Tyler Bradford?" Iron Jack looked at her for a moment. "Honest, please." "That depends," he said, "on the next 12 hours. "What happens in the next 12 hours? He glanced at Marcus. Something passed between them, not a signal, exactly, more like a confirmation. Then he looked back at Emily. A lot of people are going to want to give statements, he said, written, formal, on record. People who were in that parking lot tonight and found other things to look at and are now, having had time to think about it, prepared to reconsider what they saw. Emily stared at him. People who didn't help. People who made a different choice than you made, who are now making a different one again. His voice held no judgment on either choice, just information. And those statements are going to create a paper record of what Tyler Bradford and his friends did tonight, and a paper record of who they did it to. And he paused. A paper record of a 19-year-old girl who stood up when she didn't have to. I don't want to be a paper record. I know. He said it gently, which surprised her because gentle was not a register she'd associated with him yet. But you already are one. The paramedics report, the x-ray, the sutures, the police report that Officer Hartley is filling out right now. You exist on paper tonight, Emily, whether you want to or not. The question is, what story the paper tells. She absorbed that. Outside the glass doors, more lights were arriving in the parking lot, headlights moving slow and deliberate, the deep layered sound of engines reaching her even through the sealed hospital doors. Then Marcus Webb's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 10 seconds and said, confirmed, and hung up. He looked at Iron Jack. Bradford's father called the sheriff. Iron Jack nodded, like he'd expected this. And sheriff wants a conversation before any formal charges are filed. Bradford Sr. says his son wasn't there, says they can produce witnesses. Emily felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Witnesses who say he wasn't there. Witnesses who will say whatever Bradford Sr. pays them to say, Marcus said without particular emotion, stating a fact, not performing outrage, which is what money does when there's enough of it and the target is someone without any. The target. She understood she was the target, not just Tyler Bradford's target in the parking lot, but the target of the argument that Bradford Sr. was already building, the argument that said she was nobody, that said she had no address and no history and no standing, that said the word of a homeless teenager with cracked ribs and no insurance against the word of men with names and lawyers and the practiced confidence of people who have never lost a fight they had money in. She had known this was coming. She had felt it approaching from the moment Tyler Bradford said his own name, or had let it be said for him, which was the same thing with people like that. So what do we do? She asked. Marcus Webb looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been called a smile. Not warm exactly, satisfied, the look of a man who has been waiting for that particular question. We don't do anything, he said, the Brotherhood does. He turned his phone so she could see the screen. A message thread, long, fast, dozens of names she didn't recognize, and at the top, a number. A count updating in real time as she watched. 212, it read, then 219, then 230. What is that? Emily asked, though some part of her already understood. That, Marcus Webb said, is how many brothers have confirmed they're riding to Prescott Valley before sunrise. Emily stared at the screen. The number updated again. 241. For me, she said. The words came out smaller than she intended. Marcus Webb put the phone down. He looked at her the way that Iron Jack had looked at her in the parking lot, that expression she hadn't had words for. She was starting to find the words now in the specific combination of his face and Jack's face and the number still climbing on that phone screen. It was the expression of people who had decided she mattered. Not because she was connected to them, not because she had anything to offer, not because of her name or her address or anything she owned, because of what she had done in a dark parking lot when every reasonable calculation said to stay behind the dumpster. For you, Iron Jack said from beside her. Emily Parker sat in the hospital waiting room with wrapped hands and cracked ribs, and the medication wearing slightly thin at the edges, and she did something she had not done in front of another person in 3 months. She cried, just briefly, just enough. Then she stopped. Iron Jack said nothing. He did not offer comfort in the way that made the crying about the person witnessing it. He just sat there, which was, she was learning his specific and considerable gift. He sat there and he let it be what it was, and he didn't make her explain it or apologize for it or put it away before she was ready. Outside, the parking lot continued to fill. And in a comfortable house somewhere in Prescott Valley, Tyler Bradford had no idea yet that the night he thought he had finished was in fact just arriving at its real beginning. Tyler Bradford slept 4 hours. That was what Marcus Webb's contact inside the sheriff's department confirmed at 6:14 in the morning. Tyler had gone home, had a drink, had gone to bed. His father had made the calls. The lawyers had been retained. The machinery had been set in motion with the smooth, practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and expected it to work the same way it had always worked. Robert Bradford Sr. had been managing his son's consequences since Tyler was 17 years old, and he was very good at it. He had never once failed. He woke his son at 6:15, not because he wanted to, because his security camera feed had just shown him something that required Tyler to be awake. Tyler Bradford came to his bedroom window, still pulling on a shirt, looked out at the street in front of the family's property, and for the first time in his 23 years of life, felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a situation that his father's name could not immediately solve. There were motorcycles on his street, not 2, not 5, parked along both curbs from the corner to the cul-de-sac, engines off men and women in leather standing in the early morning quiet, in the particular way that people stand when they are not there to negotiate, not blocking the road, not on his property, not doing anything that a lawyer could put a name to. Just present, massive and organized and absolutely present the way weather is present, not asking permission, not explaining itself. Tyler counted 17 bikes visible from his window before his father appeared in the doorway behind him. "Don't go outside," Robert Bradford said. "Dad." "I said don't go outside." His voice had lost something. Tyler had never heard his father's voice lose that particular quality before the certainty. The baseline assurance that situations had solutions and solutions cost money, and money was something the Bradfords had in quantities that solved most problems before they became real problems. It was still there, but thinner, stretched. "How many are there?" Tyler asked. His father didn't answer, which was its own answer. 40 minutes earlier, Marcus Webb had stood in the Prescott Valley Town Center and watched the count on his phone reach 312 confirmed riders and had made one specific and deliberate decision. He did not send them to the Bradford property. He did not send them to the police station. He split them 20 here, 15 there in clusters across town, every location with some connection to the events of the previous night or the machinery that Robert Bradford Sr. had set in motion since. The diner, the sheriff's office, the law firm Bradford used, the courthouse. And yes, a portion to Tyler Bradford's quiet residential street, because Marcus Webb understood that the most powerful thing a large and organized group can do is not threaten, it's witness. Wordlessly, patiently, and in numbers too large to rationalize away. Back at the hospital, Emily knew none of this yet. She'd finally slept around 3 in the morning in the chair in the waiting room because the hospital had offered her a bed in an observation room, and she'd refused it twice before accepting it on the third offer, which Iron Jack had made in a tone suggesting the third offer was also the last. She woke at 7 to the sound of voices she didn't recognize and daylight through institutional blinds and 2 cracked ribs reminding her immediately and thoroughly of the previous night. Iron Jack was still there. He'd slept in the chair beside her bed, his splinted arm resting across his stomach, his eyes opening the moment she moved. She wasn't sure he'd actually slept. She was starting to suspect the man had a relationship with sleep that was more strategic than restorative. Bradford's father called the sheriff again, he said before she'd fully oriented herself. At 5:30, and again at 6. Emily sat up carefully. The ribs negotiated with her. She won barely. "What did the sheriff say?" "The sheriff," Aaron Jack said, "is currently standing on the steps of his own office explaining to a journalist from the Arizona Republic that the investigation into last night's assault is proceeding thoroughly and that all witnesses will be contacted." He paused. "There are currently 9 motorcycles in the parking lot behind the sheriff's office." Emily stared at him. 9. They're not blocking anything. They're not causing any disturbance. They're just there. His expression was the closest she'd seen it get to satisfaction. It's remarkable how clarifying that can be for people who are considering which direction their career interests lie. "The journalist," Emily said. "Who called the journalist?" Iron Jack looked at her with an expression that answered the question without words. "You did," she said. "Marcus made a call," he said. "I suggested he make it." Emily absorbed this. The man had a fractured arm in 2 places and had spent the night in a hospital chair and had been simultaneously playing a longer and more deliberate game than she'd understood. She found she wasn't surprised. She found she wasn't even entirely sure how she felt about it, whether to be grateful or unsettled or both, which was probably the most accurate answer. They're going to say I'm not credible, she said. Bradford's lawyers, because I'm homeless, because I have no address. Because, yes, Iron Jack said, just that, not arguing with her assessment. So what changes that? He reached over to the small table beside the chair and picked up his phone and handed it to her. It was open to a news article, not the Arizona Republic, a local Prescott Valley outlet, something she hadn't heard of. But it was live, published 40 minutes ago, and it had a headline that made her breath go short in a way that had nothing to do with her ribs. Homeless teen severely injured defending biker from attack in Prescott Valley, witnesses sought. She read the first 3 paragraphs. Her name was in the second one. How did they? Officer Hartley filed his report at 2 a.m, Iron Jack said. Reports are public record. A reporter who knows where to look finds them. Did you know where the reporter would look? A pause, brief. I may have made a suggestion. Emily set the phone down. She was quiet for a moment. Jack, I need you to be straight with me about something. Ask it. Is any of this actually going to matter for Tyler Bradford legally, actually? Or is this, she stopped. She was trying to find the word for what she was afraid this was. Theater, performance, a show of force that felt powerful right now and resolved into nothing by next week when the lawyers finished their work and the witnesses reconsidered their willingness to testify. And Robert Bradford Sr. finished explaining to everyone whose opinion mattered exactly who his son was and exactly who Emily Parker was not. Iron Jack looked at her for a long moment. He had a way of looking at her that felt like he was measuring something, not in a cold way, not in a way that made her feel evaluated. More like he was deciding how much truth the moment required. It depends on one thing, he said. What thing, if that being, whether the witnesses hold. And do they buy? He picked up his phone again and turned it to show her the screen. A different message thread this time, not the rider count. A list of names, 7 of them, with a single line after each name. She read them. 2 names she didn't know described as diner employees who'd been outside during their break and had seen the beginning of the altercation. One described as a delivery driver who'd pulled in during the assault. One described as a customer who'd come out the back door. 3 described only as confirmed on record. 7 witnesses. Last night, Emily said slowly, when I was out there, there was nobody. There was nobody who helped. Nobody who even came to the door. No, Iron Jack agreed. So where did 7 witnesses come from? Some of them were there and chose not to act, he said, which is a human thing. Fear is a human thing. Tyler Bradford's name on a building is a human thing, but there's a difference between not acting in the moment and choosing to protect someone who did act when asked afterward to say what you saw. He paused. Some people are capable of the second thing even when they couldn't manage the first. Emily thought about that. She thought about the specific weight of it, the men and women who had looked away from the back parking lot and kept walking, who had found somewhere else to direct their eyes and were now in the morning doing the thing they hadn't been able to do in the dark. She didn't know if that made them better or worse or just human. And the other 3, she asked, the confirmed ones. Arrived after it started, Iron Jack said. 1 was in the lot for a different reason and saw the end of it. 2 came around back when they heard raised voices and saw Tyler Bradford and his friends walking away from you on the ground. Emily was quiet. I didn't know anyone came. You were somewhat occupied, he said, dry as weathered wood. She almost laughed. Her ribs objected. She held it to a sharp exhale. The door to her room opened. Then and Marcus Webb came in without knocking, which seemed to be consistent with his general relationship to doors. He had his phone up and he was moving with purpose that meant something had shifted. Bradford Sr. just left his lawyer's office, Marcus said. He was talking to Jack, but he looked at Emily while he said it, making sure she was part of the information flow. He went directly to the sheriff's department. He's been in there 22 minutes. Without Tyler, Jack asked. Without Tyler, just the lawyer and Bradford Sr. Marcus pulled a chair from the wall and sat in it backwards, arms on the back. Which tells you something. It tells you Tyler's a liability, Emily said. Both men looked at her. If Tyler were an asset to the situation, Bradford Sr. would bring him in. Let the lawyers present him clean, remorseful, cooperative. Good optics. But he left Tyler home, which means he's already decided Tyler is someone to manage, not deploy. She looked at her wrapped hands. My dad used to watch legal dramas. I learned a few things. Marcus Webb's expression shifted. The same thing that had moved through Iron Jack's face in the parking lot was moving through his now recalibration. The specific look of people updating their understanding of who they were dealing with. She's right, Marcus said to Jack. I know, Iron Jack said with the tone of a man who had arrived at that conclusion some hours ago. The next twist arrived at 9:47 in the morning, and it arrived via a phone call to Marcus that he took in the hallway and came back from with an expression that was for the first time genuinely difficult to read. The tire iron, he said. Emily and Iron Jack both waited. Bradford's lawyer just argued to the sheriff that the tire iron was already in the parking lot, pre-existing, not brought by Tyler or either of his friends. That's insane, Emily said. One of them was holding it. I watched one of them hit Jack with it. I know that, Marcus said. You know that. The problem is the tire iron doesn't have fingerprints. The room went quiet. How does a tire iron not have fingerprints? Emily said flatly. It does not have usable fingerprints, Marcus corrected. It was on asphalt for several hours before it was collected by Officer Hartley. And the surface? He stopped. The point is, Bradford's lawyer is arguing it's inadmissible as evidence of a specific weapon used by a specific person. Emily felt the cold thing again. The familiar architecture of a system working the way it was designed to work, not for her, not for Iron Jack, not for the truth of what happened in that parking lot, but for the people with the money and the names and the lawyers who knew which levers to pull and in what order. 7 witnesses, she said. 7 witnesses who saw an assault, Marcus confirmed, but the question of who specifically used the tire iron and whether it can be classified as a weapon in the legal sense. Jack's arm is fractured in 2 places, Emily said. She heard her own voice change, not louder, harder, like something had crystallized. Yes, in my ribs. Yes, in my hands. Emily, no. She sat up straighter and her ribs said what they always said, and she overruled them the same way she always overruled them. No, listen to me. I was there. I watched it happen. I have 14 stitches and 2 cracked ribs, and I got them standing between Tyler Bradford and a man he was trying to put in the ground. And he is currently in his house while his father drives around this town using his name like a key that opens everything. She looked at Marcus, then at Iron Jack. So what do we do? Because we have to do something. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Iron Jack looked at Marcus. The journalist, Jack said. Already on it, Marcus said. Not just the Republic, all of them. Already on it, Marcus said again. He held up his phone. There are 3 reporters in the hospital parking lot right now, 2 local ones statewide. A pause. And a camera crew from Phoenix. Emily stared at him. A camera crew. The story has certain elements that news cycles respond to, Marcus said with the careful neutrality of a man who understood media well enough to know that describing what he'd set in motion too plainly would make it sound cynical, and it was not cynical. It was just the application of available tools. 19-year-old homeless girl, physical assault, prominent local family, 300 bikers. He tilted his head slightly. It's a story. They want to talk to me, Emily said. Not a question. If you're willing. She was quiet. She looked at her hands in their wrappings at the thin hospital blanket at the window, with its institutional blinds cutting the Arizona morning into horizontal bars. The thing she was feeling was not what she expected to feel. She had expected fear. She'd been invisible for 3 months, deliberately, carefully invisible, and the idea of a camera and a reporter and her name in a story had always felt like the opposite of safety. Like exposure. Like being findable by the people and situations she'd been moving away from. What she actually felt was something closer to anger. Clean anger, the kind that doesn't shake, the kind that settles. Tyler Bradford's father is in the sheriff's office right now, she said, talking about tire iron fingerprints. Yes, Marcus said, and Tyler Bradford is at home. Yes, because he's assuming I'm nobody. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. I want to talk to the reporters. Marcus Webb stood up from the chair, and the look on his face, the look that was not quite a smile, that was something harder and more meaningful than a smile, appeared again, full and unguarded for the first time. "Then let's go," he said. Iron Jack reached over and put his right hand briefly on her arm. Just briefly. Just long enough to be unambiguous. Then he stood and Emily stood, and the three of them walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the lobby. Outside in the parking lot, the camera crew from Phoenix was setting up. The two local reporters were already talking to Marcus's brothers, not for quotes, just presence, just the visual geometry of 300 people who had driven from across Arizona to stand outside a hospital for a 19-year-old girl whose name they hadn't known 12 hours ago. And inside the sheriff's office, across town, Robert Bradford Sr. was still talking about tire iron fingerprints. He did not yet know that the conversation in the room that mattered had already moved somewhere else entirely. That the room that mattered was not the sheriff's office or the law firm or the comfortable house on the quiet street. The room that mattered was a hospital lobby where a girl with wrapped hands and cracked ribs and 3 months of practiced invisibility had decided she was done being invisible. And the camera was already running. The interview lasted 11 minutes. Emily had expected it to feel like an interrogation. She'd expected the reporter, a woman named Dana Shields from the Phoenix affiliate, mid-30s. The kind of compose that comes from years of standing in front of cameras during bad situations to ask leading questions, to push for emotional moments, to try to manufacture something that would cut well in a 90-second segment. She'd prepared herself for that. She'd spent 3 months developing the ability to read situations and people quickly, and she'd spent the walk down the hospital corridor quietly deciding what she would say and what she wouldn't. What she hadn't prepared for was Dana Shields looking at her for exactly 3 seconds before the camera rolled and saying quietly, just between them, "Just tell me what happened. Start wherever feels right. I won't interrupt you." So Emily told her. Not everything, not the 3 months behind the dumpster, not the specifics of how she'd ended up in Prescott Valley instead of somewhere else, not the longer story that lived behind the shorter one. But she told her about that night, about the sound of the first hit, about the calculation she hadn't made about the asphalt, and the second time she'd gotten up in the tire iron in Jack's arm at that wrong angle. She told it in plain language without drama because she didn't have the energy for drama and because the facts laid flat and honest were dramatic enough on their own. She kept her hands in her lap where the camera could see the wrappings. She hadn't planned that. She just hadn't known where else to put them. When she finished, Dana Shields was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know why you did it? Why you stepped in?" Emily had thought about this, had been thinking about it since the moment she'd found herself standing between 3 men and Iron Jack, with nothing but her body and her refusal. She had good answers and true answers, and they were not the same answer. "Because nobody else was going to," she said. Dana Shields nodded, slowly. Like that was the answer she'd expected, and the answer she hadn't been sure she'd get both at once. "And you knew they might hurt you." "I knew they would," Emily said. "That wasn't the part I was thinking about." The camera operator lowered his camera about a 1/4 inch. Just slightly, just enough that Emily noticed. She filed it away. The segment aired at noon. Marcus Webb had a contact at the station. He seemed to have contacts everywhere, which Emily was learning was less about personal charisma and more about 30 years of operating in a world where knowing the right people was simply a survival skill, same as knowing how to ride in bad weather or how to read a road you'd never been on before. The contact pushed the segment to the noon broadcast instead of the evening one. By 12:15, it had been shared 400 times on social media. By 12:40, a second Phoenix station was calling the hospital's general line asking for Emily Parker. She didn't know any of this at noon, because at noon she was eating a hospital lunch that she was eating entirely because Iron Jack had sat across from her and watched her with patient, immovable attention until she picked up the fork. She was hungrier than she'd realized. She was always hungrier than she realized 3 months of eating from dumpsters calibrated. Your hunger signals strangely taught your body to stop announcing needs. It had learned wouldn't be met. "You did well," Iron Jack said when she was halfway through. "I just talked." "You talked clearly. You didn't perform." He was eating 2 left-handed, his right arm navigating the hospital tray with the careful focus of a man doing something simple that has temporarily become complicated. People can tell the difference, even through a screen, especially people who've seen a lot of a performance. Dana Shields seemed decent, Emily said. She is decent, Jack said. She did a story 3 years ago on a veteran being evicted from his apartment in Scottsdale. That story resulted in a nonprofit raising enough money in 72 hours to cover his back rent and set up a support fund for 6 other veterans in the same complex. He looked at her steadily. She knows what she's doing, and she's careful about who she does it for. You know her, Emily said. I know of her, he said. Marcus checked her out before we agreed to the interview. You agreed to the interview. I'm the one who decided to do it. Yes, he said, you are. And the way he said it, not correcting her, just confirming, just making sure she understood that the agency was hers and had been hers, was the kind of thing that settled into her chest alongside the rib pain and sat there differently. At 1:15, Marcus came back in at the speed that meant something had moved. Bradford's lawyer called the district attorney's office, he said. Emily set her fork down. And they were trying to get ahead of the charges, framing it as a mutual altercation suggesting Bradford's clients were acting in self-defense after being approached aggressively. Marcus stopped, not because he'd run out of information, because the next part required a specific delivery. The DA's office told them they would respond to any formal communication in writing within the standard time frame. Iron Jack looked up from his food. They didn't take the call. They took the call, Marcus said. They just didn't give Bradford's lawyer what Bradford's lawyer wanted, which is the same as not taking the call for the purposes of Robert Bradford Sr.'s current strategy. He sat down. There's a reason for that? The segment, Emily said. The segment, Marcus confirmed. By the time Bradford's lawyer made that call, the DA's office had already received 11 emails from constituents about the case. 11 emails in the 90 minutes since the noon broadcast. He looked at Emily. The DA has elected Emily. 11 emails in 90 minutes on a Monday is not something an elected official ignores. Emily was quiet, processing the chain of causality. Her 11 minutes in front of a camera translated into 11 emails, translated into a lawyer's phone call, going sideways, translated into Robert Bradford Sr.'s careful machinery, hitting a gear it hadn't expected to find. What does Bradford do now? She asked. He pivots, Iron Jack said. He's been building one argument. It didn't hold. He builds another. What's the other one? Marcus and Iron Jack exchanged the kind of look that meant they'd already discussed this and had decided on a specific order to present it. Emily recognized the look because she'd been watching both of them long enough to understand their particular shorthand. The other argument, Marcus said carefully, involves your history. The room temperature didn't change. Emily's internal temperature did. My history, she said. Bradford Sr. hired a private investigator last night. We know this because the investigator made inquiries, calls to the Tempe shelter system, calls to a social services office. He was asking about you specifically, your background, whether there were any circumstances that could be used to characterize you as unreliable. Emily's hands were in her lap again. She was aware of the wrappings, of the specific weight of the question Marcus hadn't quite asked. And what did he find, she said. We don't know yet what he found, Marcus said. We know what he was looking for. I'll tell you what he was looking for, Emily said. Her voice was even. She'd had 3 months to practice even. When I was 17, my mother's boyfriend and I had a situation. The police were involved, and I was not charged with anything because I was defending myself and a 14-year-old boy who lived in the same house, and the boyfriend had a prior record that made the rest of it very clear very quickly. But there's a report, and in that report, I am listed as a person of interest for approximately 48 hours before they cleared me. She looked at Marcus. That's what he found. That's what he's going to use. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Iron Jack spoke first. You were protecting a child. Yes. And you were cleared. Completely. No charges, no record, nothing. She paused. But a private investigator's report doesn't lead with the clearing. It leads with the words, person of interest, and lets the reader draw their own conclusions. Marcus was already on his phone, typing fast. I need the full incident documentation, he said to the phone rather than to her. Tempe PD case from approximately 2 years ago, complainant or related party Emily Parker, 17 years old at the time. Public record, we need it pulled today. He lowered the phone. If Bradford's lawyer tries to introduce that information without the full context, we need the full context ready to counter it before they finish the sentence. Emily watched him move. She watched Iron Jack's face, which was doing that calculation thing again. Cold professional processing angles and contingencies. She felt something that she recognized distantly as the feeling of being on a team. She had not felt that in a long time. "There's something else," she said. Both men looked at her. "The boy I was protecting. He's 16 now. He's in foster care in Mesa. His name is Danny." She stopped. "He doesn't know any of this is happening. But if Bradford's people start pulling records and his name comes up, it won't," Marcus said with a certainty that was not performative. "He's a minor. His records are sealed. Bradford's PI can't touch them. But the story of that night is yours to tell," Iron Jack said, "on your terms, to whoever you choose. Not Bradford's version of it, not a PI summary of it. Yours." Emily nodded. She held on to that for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, what do we need to do?" What they needed to do, as Marcus laid it out over the next 20 minutes, was build a public record faster than Bradford could build a private counter-narrative. The 7 witnesses needed to formalize their statements, not just cooperate with police inquiries, but give formal written statements to the DA's office directly on record with dates and signatures. The medical documentation, her x-rays, her suture records, Iron Jack's fracture assessment needed to be formally submitted as evidence rather than left as hospital records that required a subpoena to access. And Emily needed to be represented, not by a public defender, by someone who would not be outspent. "I can't pay a lawyer," Emily said. "You won't have to," Marcus said. "Marcus, there are attorneys," he said, "who take cases because the case is the kind of case that matters. Not pro bono exactly. They get paid eventually through settlements, through judgments. But they don't get paid by you up front. They get paid when the people who hurt you pay." He looked at her. "Bradford Sr. has resources. That works for his lawyer. It also works for the right lawyer on your side because the settlement potential is significant." "I don't want his money," Emily said. "I know," Marcus said. "That's not a decision you have to make today. Today you just have to agree to be represented." She looked at Iron Jack. He was watching her with that steady, undemanding attention that she had come to understand was his way of communicating, not pushing, not selling, just being present while she worked through it. "Okay," she said. "Okay, yes." The attorney arrived at 3:30. Her name was Sandra Reyes. She was 51, compact with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a legal pad that she'd apparently filled 3 pages of before she even walked into Emily's room. She sat down, looked at Emily for about 4 seconds, the same assessing, unhurried look that Iron Jack and Marcus both had, the look of people who had learned to read situations quickly and didn't waste the information, and said, "Tell me everything. Don't edit. Don't decide what's relevant and what isn't. That's my job." So Emily told her everything, including the part about Tempe, including Danny, including her 3 months on the streets and how she'd ended up in Prescott Valley specifically, and what the 11 days behind that particular dumpster had looked like before last night. Sandra Reyes wrote without looking up, 3 more pages on the legal pad. When Emily finished, she sat back and took off her reading glasses and held them. "Bradford's team is going to argue 3 things," Sandra said. "Provocation that their clients felt threatened and responded accordingly. Unreliable witness using your housing situation in the Tempe incident as character evidence. And weapon ambiguity, the tire iron argument." She put the glasses back on her head. "We counter provocation with the 7 witness statements and the medical evidence. We counter the character attack with the full Tempe documentation and with your cooperation with law enforcement from the moment the incident occurred. And the weapon ambiguity," she paused. "Tell me exactly what you saw. Not what you inferred, what you physically saw." Emily described it, the friend's hand on the tire iron, the specific motion, the sound of contact with Jack's arm. The angle. Sandra wrote it down word for word. "And Mr. Dawson, what did he see?" The same thing Iron Jack said from his chair in the corner. Sandra looked at him, at his splinted arm, at his eye, which had developed a significant bruise above the cut that had been sutured early that morning. "You'll testify to that?" "Absolutely," he said. "Then we have 2 direct eyewitness accounts of weapon use supported by injury evidence consistent with that weapon and that mechanism of injury." She closed the legal pad. "Bradford's lawyer is smart, but smart runs out of road when the facts are this clear and the witnesses are this solid." She looked at Emily. "You understand this may take time, months, possibly longer. I've been living behind a dumpster for 3 months, Emily said. I understand time. Something moved across Sandra Reyes's face. Not pity. Something warmer and more complicated than pity. We're going to do well, she said. Not a prediction, a statement of intention. At 4:50, the second major twist of the day arrived, and it arrived via a phone call to Marcus from his contact at the sheriff's office. He took it in the hallway. He came back in 30 seconds. He stood in the doorway and he looked at Emily and Iron Jack and he said, "One of Bradford's friends is talking." Emily's breath stopped. "Which one?" Iron Jack asked. "Ryan Garrett, the one who hit the car during the altercation." Marcus stepped fully into the room. He came in voluntarily, walked into the sheriff's office 40 minutes ago with his own lawyer, different firm from Bradford's, which tells you something about how unified their position actually is this morning. He paused for effect, which Emily was beginning to understand was one of Marcus Webb's particular skills. He gave a full statement, named Tyler Bradford as the initiator, confirmed the tire iron, confirmed it was deliberate use against a person and not accidental contact. The room was silent for 4 seconds. "Why?" Emily said. "Why would he do that?" "Because Ryan Garrett is 22 years old and he's looking at aggravated assault charges, and he just watched your interview on his phone, and he understood possibly for the first time since last night that the situation he's in is not going to be managed away by Robert Bradford Sr.'s lawyers." Marcus looked at her steadily. "Because you put a face on it. You made it real. And real is a lot harder to sit across from at 3 in the morning when you're deciding what your own future looks like." Sandra Reyes was already standing. "I need to get to the DA's office before Bradford's team hears about this and tries to negotiate around it." She was out of the room in under 30 seconds. Emily heard her heels on the corridor floor moving fast. Emily sat with what had just happened. She sat with the weight of it. Ryan Garrett in the sheriff's office, voluntarily with his own lawyer because he'd watched her on his phone. Because 11 minutes in a steady voice and 2 wrapped hands in a camera frame had crossed whatever line existed between him and the decision he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd walked away from that parking lot. "He's going to face consequences too," she said. "Yes," Iron Jack said. "He hurt you. He was part of it." "Yes," Jack said again. "And he's going to answer for it. His cooperation may reduce what he answers for. That's how it works." "Does that bother you that he gets something for cooperating?" Iron Jack considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which she appreciated. "What bothers me," he said finally, "is what happened to you in that parking lot. What Tyler Bradford did. What all 3 of them did, and what none of the people who saw it did in the moment." He looked at his splinted arm. "What Ryan Garrett does now doesn't change what he did then. But if what he does now means Tyler Bradford answers for all of it, for you, for the tire iron, for all of it, then I can live with the math." Emily nodded. Outside in the parking lot, there were still more than 200 bikes. Men and women eating from bags someone had organized, talking, some sleeping in their seats. They had jobs they weren't at. Lives that had been set aside. They were there because Iron Jack had made a call, and because the call had gone out, and because the number on Marcus's phone had climbed through the night to a count that had made Tyler Bradford look out his bedroom window at 6 in the morning and feel for the first time what it was like to be on the wrong side of something too large to name drop your way out of. Carol Weston arrived at 5:30. Emily didn't know who she was at first, a woman in her late 50s. Practical clothes, the bearing of someone who managed things and people, and did it without making it look like management. She introduced herself quietly without theater. Director of the Prescott Valley Women's Resource Center. She'd seen the noon broadcast. She'd made some calls. She had a room available. Immediately. Private, safe, no waiting list. "I don't need charity," Emily said. Old reflex. She heard it come out of her mouth and recognized it for what it was before it finished landing. Carol Weston's expression didn't change. "It's not charity," she said. "It's a room. You can decide what you want to do with it." Emily looked at her hands, looked at Iron Jack, who was watching her with that patient, undemanding attention. "Okay," Emily said. For the 3rd time that day, to a different question, the same answer. Okay. Small word, heavy with everything she was letting it carry. Carol Weston's room turned out to be on the 2nd floor of a building that smelled like fresh paint and clean laundry, and something Emily couldn't immediately name, but recognized after a moment as the absence of fear. Not safety exactly, she wasn't ready to call it that yet, but the absence of the specific low-grade dread that had been running under everything for 3 months, the background noise of a life lived without walls. She slept 11 hours the first night. She didn't mean to. She lay down on the bed, an actual bed with actual sheets, with a pillow that didn't smell like asphalt, intending to rest for an hour. And when she opened her eyes, the light through the window had moved completely, and her phone, which Marcus Webb had sourced from somewhere and placed in her hands the previous evening, with the particular matter-of-factness of a man who considered a phone a tool rather than a gift, showed 6:47 in the morning. She lay still for a moment and took inventory. Ribs negotiable, hands stiff manageable, mind loud. The case was moving. Sandra Reyes had called at 9 the previous night with an update delivered at the speed of someone who had been doing law for 25 years and had learned to strip information to its essential structure. Ryan Garrett's statement had been formally received by the DA's office. It corroborated every material point of both Emily's and Jack's accounts. The DA had called Sandra directly, not through intermediaries, not through the formal channel, and had told her that charges would be filed against Tyler Bradford and the third friend whose name Emily now knew was Connor Mills within 72 hours. 72 hours, Emily had said, which in this context means they're not waiting, Sandra had said. 72 hours is the formal language. The decision is already made. Emily had sat with that after she hung up. The decision is already made. She'd spent enough time on the receiving end of decisions made about her by systems, by strangers, by people with authority over circumstances she couldn't control, to understand that there were decisions and then there were decisions. This one felt different. This one had her name in it as something other than a variable to be managed. She was thinking about that when her phone rang at 7:15. Unknown number, Arizona area code. She almost didn't answer, old habit. Then she answered, "Is this Emily Parker?" A woman's voice. Careful, not the careful of someone being professional, the careful of someone being precise about something that mattered to her personally. "Yes," Emily said. "My name is Janet Orozco. I was the night manager at the Denny's on Route 69. A pause, short and heavy. "I saw what happened." Emily sat up. Her ribs reminded her of their status. She ignored them. "You were there." "I was inside. I saw it through the window." Another pause. "I didn't come out. I've been sitting with that since it happened, and I need you to know that I'm sorry. I picked up the phone twice to call 911, and both times She stopped. "I know who Tyler Bradford's father is. I know what that name means for a business on that side of town. That's not an excuse. I'm telling you the truth of what happened in my head, not asking you to forgive it." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Did you call 911 the third time?" A beat. "Yes, but it was after. It was too late for it to have mattered." "It was on record," Emily said, "that it was called at all. That matters for the timeline." "I know. The police told me that when they came to take my statement yesterday afternoon." Janet Orozco's voice shifted. "I gave them a full statement, Emily. Everything I saw from the window. Start to finish, I told them about the tire iron. I told them about all three of them. And I told them." She paused one more time, and when she continued, her voice had something different in it, something that cost her. "I told them I watched you get up off that ground twice and stand back in front of that man, and I've been a night manager in this town for 11 years, and I have never once seen anything like that." Emily didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure a response was what Janet Orozco needed. Sometimes people call to deliver something, not to receive anything back. "Thank you," Emily said finally, "for calling." "Thank you," Janet said, "for doing what I didn't." The call lasted 4 more minutes. When it ended, Emily sat on the edge of the bed with her wrapped hands in her lap in the early Arizona morning coming through the window and the ribs and the weight of everything, and she let it all be exactly what it was for about 90 seconds. Then she got up and went to find coffee. The resource center had a common kitchen on the ground floor. Carol Weston was already there, which Emily suspected was not coincidental. The woman had an instinct for timing that suggested long experience with people in transitions, knowing when to be present and when to stay away, and making the former look like accident. "How did you sleep?" Carol asked. 11 hours, Emily said. Carol set a mug in front of her without being asked. "Good." Emily sat, drank. Let the silence be comfortable, which it was. Carol Weston generated comfortable silences, the way some people generate noise naturally and without apparent effort. Janet Orozco called me this morning, Emily said. I know Janet, Carol said. She volunteers here sometimes, holiday meal service. Emily looked at her over the mug. You knew her. I know a lot of people in this town, Carol said without apology or elaboration. Some of them are going to come forward in the next few days that you don't expect. When something like this happens, when someone does what you did and it becomes visible, it has a way of making other people take stock of what they've been choosing not to see. She poured her own coffee. It's not comfortable being made to take stock, but it's necessary. Some of them looked away, Emily said. In that parking lot. Yes. And now they're giving statements. Yes. Does that make it better or not? Carol sat down across from her. She didn't rush to answer, which Emily was coming to understand was a quality shared by the people in this situation she trusted most. It makes it more honest, Carol said finally. Whether it makes it better is something you'll be working out for a long time. That's okay. You're allowed to work it out slowly. At 10:30 that morning, Sandra Reyes called again. Her voice had a different quality than it had the previous evening, tighter, faster, with an undercurrent that Emily had learned to identify in the 20 hours she'd known her as the sound of a lawyer who has information that is both good and complicated. Tyler Bradford's attorney contacted my office at 9 this morning, Sandra said. They wanted to discuss a resolution. Emily felt the air in the room change. A settlement. They're calling it an early resolution conversation, which is lawyer language for we know we're losing and we want to negotiate the terms of how we lose before a judge decides them for us. What does that mean for the charges? The criminal charges proceed regardless, Sandra said. The DA is not involved in this conversation and doesn't need to be. What Bradford's team wants to negotiate is the civil side, the medical costs, the damages, the all. I told you I don't want his money, Emily said. I know, Sandra said, and I want you to hear me carefully when I tell you that what you want and what you need are not always the same thing, and part of my job is to hold that distinction for you when the situation is emotionally charged. A pause. You have 14 sutures and 2 cracked ribs and 3 months of documented housing instability that was not your choice. A civil resolution doesn't mean you're selling your dignity. It means the person who hurt you is required to materially account for what they did. Emily stared at the ceiling. What does Bradford Sr. want in exchange? He wants a statement from you acknowledging that Ryan Garrett's cooperation was voluntary and not coerced, which is true, and costs you nothing to say. He wants the civil matter resolved privately without additional media involvement. He wants me to stop talking to reporters. He wants this to stop being a story, Sandra said. Yes. And if I refuse, then we proceed to civil litigation, which will take longer, be more expensive for everyone, and will be significantly more public than anything that has happened so far. Sandra's voice was even and informational. I am not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what each road looks like. Emily was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Sandra said her name once carefully. I'm here, Emily said. I'm thinking. What she was thinking about was not the money. She understood on a practical level what Sandra was telling her, that material accountability was real and not shameful to accept. She'd grown up watching people who'd been wronged refuse compensation out of pride and end up with nothing but the pride which didn't pay rent or put food in a refrigerator. What she was thinking about was Danny, 16 years old in a foster placement in Mesa. The boy she'd protected when she was 17, whose name was in a file somewhere that Bradford's private investigator had been circling. She had told Sandra about him. Sandra had assured her his records were sealed, but a civil litigation process, long public, increasingly invasive, created pressure in all kinds of directions. Created incentives for people to look harder at things they'd been unable to access through normal channels. She was thinking about whether her refusal to settle was courage, or whether it was something that looked like courage, but was actually just stubbornness wearing courage's clothes. What would the resolution include, as she asked? Sandra told her. Emily listened to every number, every term. She asked 3 questions, and Sandra answered them precisely. Then she said, I need to talk to Iron Jack. There was a brief pause on Sandra's end. Of course, she said. Iron Jack answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring she was noticing. Not the first, which would suggest he'd been waiting. Not the third or fourth, which would suggest delay. Second ring every time, like a man who pays attention and demonstrates it through small, consistent actions. She told him the offer. All of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. What do you want to do? I want Tyler Bradford in a courtroom, she said. I want him to have to sit in a chair in front of a judge and have what he did said out loud in language that goes on a record that lasts. The criminal case does that, Ironjack said, regardless of what you do on the civil side. I know. Then the civil question is separate. Is it? Emily said. Because it doesn't feel separate. It feels like if I take their money, I'm giving Bradford Sr. something he wants, and I don't want to give him anything. Ironjack was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? Yes. Robert Bradford Sr. has been giving people like Tyler Bradford what they want their entire lives, he said. That's the problem. That's the root of the whole thing. The money, the protection, the managed consequences, that's what built the man who swung a tire iron at a 60-year-old biker and laughed while he did it. His voice was even and clear. Taking a settlement doesn't give Bradford Sr. something he wants. It gives you something you need. Those are different transactions. Emily closed her eyes, held the phone. And Danny, she said quietly. And Danny, Ironjack agreed. A long civil case is unpredictable. Protecting a 16-year-old boy from becoming collateral to a process that already hurt you once is not weakness. It's the same instinct that got you off that asphalt twice. She opened her eyes. Kaya, she said, for what she had lost count of as the total number of times she'd said it in the last 24 hours. Okay, tell Sandra yes. The criminal charges against Tyler Bradford were filed at 2 p.m. Aggravated assault, assault with a deadly weapon. The third friend, Connor Mills, was charged jointly. Ryan Garrett, in exchange for his full cooperation, received a reduced charge of simple assault with a recommendation for probation. The DA's office issued a 2-paragraph statement confirming the filing. Sandra Reyes issued a statement on Emily's behalf that was 4 sentences long and said everything necessary and nothing extra. The civil settlement was signed 3 weeks later. Emily didn't tell anyone the number. Sandra told her she didn't have to, and she didn't. What she did with the first portion of it was pay the hospital bill in full, Ironjack's and hers both, which Ironjack objected to with the stiff dignity of a man who has never willingly let someone else pay his debts, and which Emily overruled with the calm certainty of a woman who had made her decision and was not interested in revisiting it. You sat beside me in a hospital chair all night with a fractured arm, she told him. You don't get to argue about this. He argued anyway. She didn't move. He stopped arguing. The twist that nobody had predicted, not Sandra, not Marcus, not Ironjack, came 6 days after the settlement was signed, and it came from a direction that made the whole town recalibrate the story it had been telling itself about what had happened. Robert Bradford Sr. resigned from the Yavapai County Economic Development Board. Voluntarily. No statement, no explanation offered. He simply submitted a letter and did not return calls from the 2 reporters who had been covering the case since Dana Shields' noon segment had opened the door. His attorney issued a 3-sentence statement saying his client was focusing on his family. His client's son, Tyler Bradford, had agreed as part of a plea negotiation framework to 28 months in a state correctional facility, 2 years supervised probation, and court-mandated counseling. His lawyer called it an unfortunate situation. The DA's office called it accountability. Emily called it a Tuesday because she was done giving Tyler Bradford more of her time than he'd earned, which was none. Marcus Webb called her that evening. He was brief, which she had come to understand meant he was moved because Marcus Webb, in full emotional register, communicated in the compression of a man who has learned that the most important things don't require many words. You did good, he said. We did good, Emily said. No, Marcus said. You did it first, in a dark parking lot with nobody watching and nothing to gain. The rest of us just showed up after. She didn't argue. She was learning when to argue and when to let someone give her the thing they were trying to give her. 8 weeks after that night, Emily Parker moved into a studio apartment on the north side of Prescott Valley. First month paid deposit covered an arrangement that Carol Weston had constructed through a combination of Resource Center funds, a private donor who had read the Arizona Republic piece and chosen to act on it, and a landlord named George Tillis, who had seen the noon segment on the day it aired and had called Carol that same afternoon to ask if there was anything useful he could do. There was. He did it. Iron Jack came to see the apartment on the day she moved in. He brought coffee and a small plant in a clay pot, a succulent the kind that thrives in Arizona heat and requires minimal attention and is essentially impossible to kill, which she suspected was not accidental. He set it on the windowsill, looked around the room, nodded once. "Good light on," he said. "It's a start," Emily said. "It's more than a start." He looked at her. His arm was out of the splint. His eye had healed. He looked like himself, big and quiet and deliberate, the man from the parking lot who had called her Emily before she told him to and had sat beside her in a hospital chair all night and had answered every phone call on the second ring. "You know, Marcus wants to talk to you about the foundation." He mentioned it. The foundation was Marcus Webb's idea, proposed during a chapter meeting 3 weeks after the arrest, and voted into existence by unanimous agreement. A small fund named without fanfare and without asking Emily's permission first, which she had both objected to and been quietly moved by the Emily Parker Fund. Emergency assistance for homeless youth in Yavapai County. Housing First Night's medical costs the specific acute needs that the existing system's gaps left unmet. Seed money from the chapter. An application for state matching funds already submitted. "He wants me to sit on the advisory board," Emily said. "Do you want to?" She looked at the succulent on the windowsill, at the room that was hers, at the door that locked from the inside with a key that lived in her pocket. "Yes," she said, "I do." Iron Jack nodded. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, Prescott Valley was doing what it always did, moving, busy, and different, in the way that towns are indifferent, full of people making their own calculations about what they owed each other and how much they were willing to pay. "Jack," she said. "Yeah. That night, in the parking lot, you told me to go. Before it got worse, you told me to leave." "I did," he said. "Why didn't you try harder?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because you'd already decided," he said. "And I've been around long enough to know that when someone has decided something like that, when they've made that particular choice, you don't talk them out of it. You just make sure you're standing close enough to matter." She held that. It was true. It had been true from the moment she'd come around that corner at a full run with nothing but herself and her refusal. And it had been true in every moment since, in the hospital, in the interview in Sandra Reyes' office, in the conversation about the settlement, in the quiet of Carol Weston's kitchen with a cup of coffee and a comfortable silence. She had decided every time. On the asphalt and in the chair, and on the phone and in the apartment with the good light and the succulent on the windowsill. She had decided, and the world had shifted to account for it, not because the world was fair, it wasn't, it had never been, but because one decision made in the dark by a girl with nothing had been real enough and loud enough and stubborn enough to matter. 3 months later, she enrolled in Yavapai College. General Studies. She wasn't sure yet what she was moving toward. That was okay. She was moving. Danny turned 17 that November. Emily drove to Mesa and took him to lunch, and they sat across from each other in a diner booth. Not a Denny's. She had developed a specific relationship with Denny's that required some distance, and she told him for the first time the full version of what had happened in that parking lot. Not the version in the newspaper, the real version. The version with the asphalt and the second time she got up and the specific cold clarity of making a choice that couldn't be unmade. Danny listened the way he always listened, completely without interruption. His eyes serious in the way they'd been serious since he was 14, and the world had given him very specific reasons to take things seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You always did that, even before." "Did what?" "Got back up." He looked at her. "I used to think it was stubbornness. But it's not, is it?" "No," Emily said, "it's not." He nodded, like he was filing that away, like it was something he planned to use. She paid for lunch. He argued. She didn't move. He stopped arguing. Iron Jack came to her first community advisory meeting in February. He sat in the back row and didn't say anything during the meeting itself, which was about the fund's first 3 cases, 3 young people in circumstances that rhymed in various ways with 11 days behind a dumpster and a sleeping bag and the practiced art of not being seen. When the meeting ended and people were putting on coats and gathering papers, he waited until it was just the 2 of them, and he said, "You're good at this." "I'm learning," Emily said. "You're good at it," he said again in the tone that meant the conversation on that point was concluded. She looked at him, this man who had been a stranger in a parking lot 6 months ago, and was now something she didn't have a clean word for. Not family exactly, though it rhymed with family. Not mentor exactly, though it rhymed with that too. The man who had sat beside her without being asked and had answered on the second ring and had told her that someone had decided she mattered and had then spent 6 months proving it was not something he'd said lightly. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting on that curb." "Thank you," Iron Jack said, "for coming around that corner." Emily Parker had walked into that parking lot with nothing. No name anyone knew, no address, no armor. Just 19 years old and a moral reflex that fired before reason could shut it down, and the specific stubbornness of a person who has survived enough to know the difference between the things that break you and the things that just hurt. She had been invisible. She had chosen in one unreasonable, irreversible moment not to be. And the world, imperfect, slow, resistant, and ultimately unable to ignore what it had witnessed, had been reckoning with that choice ever since. She had gotten up off that asphalt twice. She had gotten up every day since. And every person who had benefited from the Emily Parker Fund, every young person who had walked into a shelter with a first night paid, and a door that locked from the inside, every single one of them, was living proof that one girl, invisible and alone and with everything against her, had decided that someone else's pain was worth more than her own safety. That is the kind of courage that doesn't make the news until it already has. And once it does, it never stops moving.